I am beyond excited to introduce a modern day Renaissance man, a national place winner in bodybuilding, one of the most well-read individuals I've ever met, and also a former member of the armed forces, Kristian Mirabile. Welcome into Forever Forward, man.
Thank you. Thank you.
One reason I'm really excited to have you on is you followed quite a non-traditional path.
Yeah.
I'm somebody that's kind of followed the road most traveled. You followed the road less traveled.
Yeah.
And ultimately that road led you to the Middle East. The end of high school to Afghanistan. What went on?
Pretty much joined the military right out of high school. I really wanted to get into aerospace propulsion maintenance. Like, I wanted to be a pilot really bad. Like, I always had like high hopes, kind of big dreams, and I saw college as slower, I think, and that's one of the reasons why I like didn't want to do it. I don't know. I saw the ability to move outside of that. I also didn't really try super hard in high school, and so my grades weren't good, so I
Fair
was
enough.
definitely limited in the options, But I always wanted to be in the military since I was a little kid, so I kind of like always just knew I was going to do that anyway. I wanted to go Marines, but my parents convinced me to talk to all the branches first. Ended up hearing it phrased differently by the Air Force in a way I liked more, so I went with Air Force.
You had kind of a unique role in the Air Force, I want to say,
Yeah.
at least a role that I wasn't aware exists. So I'm curious, could you talk a little bit about what you did specifically for the Air Force? Because I feel like it's kind of niche.
I scored well on the ASVAB, so I could choose whatever jobs I wanted, and they pretty much let you choose when you sign up as a junior, which I did. They let you choose 5 jobs, and you're guaranteed one of those 5 jobs. The last on the list was firefighting. I didn't expect to do it. My recruiter was a firefighter. It's what I ultimately ended up getting. But what I wanted to do was be a pilot really bad, So all my other jobs were related to that. I guess God had other plans. I got a call, hey, you're going to be a firefighter. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to be a firefighter,
I didn't even know that job exists. So
yeah.
like, where did that take you and where were you initially stationed?
So I was stationed at the Air Force Academy in Colorado. I did training in Texas first, and then I got stationed at the Air Force Academy. Spent like 3 years there. I got out of my contract early because I was young and dumb and, got in a little trouble, but it wasn't that bad or anything. And my commander was like, dude, like, you're a good kid. Like, we think you're going to do better outside. And so pretty much got out of my contract early with no real downside at all. I got a general discharge. It goes honorable, general, less than honorable, and then dishonorable discharge. So general's the only difference is that I just don't get my college paid for, which isn't a big deal.
Understood.
But the cool thing is right after I got out, I had a good friend from training in firefighting who managed to get a job at the embassy in Afghanistan while he's out. And he gave me a call and he's like, hey, I heard you're out of the military. I can get you a job at the embassy in Afghanistan if you want. You just have to like, get a couple certifications real quick and pass a test and get a secret clearance. And yeah.
I mean, it's pretty unbelievable. And you were stationed in Kabul, Afghanistan, which I think everybody knows. And as we all should have those images seared into our brain of the withdrawal there. What was your day-to-day like in Afghanistan? What were the types of things that you were actually doing?
I mean, I'm hesitant. I don't want to say too much because I know I'm like not supposed to talk about a lot. I'm not really sure where the boundaries are and haven't talked to anyone. I've been out for a long time. And I haven't been, I was there like pretty much all through 2018, right, like a year before everything happened, year and a half before everything happened. But I was just a firefighter and I don't want to say anything close to official, you know what I mean? But I'll say like while I was there, like day to day was pretty much just, checking out the trucks. You do a briefing in the morning, check out the trucks, make sure everything's safe. You have to know the place. Stay up to date on your training, on your certifications, all that kind of stuff, But we were mostly there for earthquakes, helicopter crashes, and bombs. That was like our primary thing. So we focused a lot on like staying up to date with like triage. So like if a helicopter crashes, like what do you do?
I won't even probe because I'm sure this is above my clearance level, but I do want to say thank you. I mean, I can imagine that's not an easy job, and you've probably been in situations that most of us probably would not know the first thing to do in.
The training was good. The training was hard, for sure. They definitely trained us very well. Just being a firefighter in the Air Force, you get a lot more certifications than you do on the outside. It takes like in a shorter amount of time. Typically, you get like airport rescue firefighter certified, like it's cool. It's a cool thing to say, you know what I mean? But do I ever use it? Like how often are planes crashing around, you know what I mean? But it is cool. It's one of those things where you get good at like you calm down in stress.
Right.
when it gets really stressful when the house is on fire, I calm down now, which is an interesting
feeling. That's such a unique skill, dude, because I just bug out 24/7.
No.
So that's extremely unique. And I feel like once you've been in situations like the ones you've probably been in, everything else feels a little bit easier, I can imagine.
Yeah, but I'll say what happened to me was like I ended up getting really restless when it's like calm, if it's like calm and peaceful for a while. I had to
Right.
learn how to like be okay with calm and not think something is wrong. Like, oh,
Maybe you always feel like a little on edge, like something.
yeah,
I feel like something should be going wrong right now, and it's not.
yeah, yeah. They like kind of
Yeah.
train you to like always be like ready, you know?
Well, look, after you left, I know that you went into personal training, and fitness has been a massive part of your life for a long time. So, can you just talk a bit about how important fitness has been to you and what it was like
Yeah,
to be a
dude.
personal trainer,
Fitness
having
is
trained over, if I'm not mistaken, 1,000
Yeah,
clients?
for sure. Over the years, for sure. Fitness saved my life, dude. I love fitness. It's amazing. I think it's like I say this to my clients a lot, and I think it sums up how I feel about it, and other things, in a large way, which is that like I feel like you can categorize life into like three major ways you can look at it or groups, right? There's things that are negative reinforcement loops that take more energy than you put in, right? So like vapes, right? Like perfect example,
Drinking. Yeah.
drinking, drugs, like all your vices typically for sure. And then you have most things which are just transactional, right? They're equal transaction, right? Ideally. And then ideally we have positive reinforcement loops, things that actually give you back more energy than you put in, right? Gardening is an example of that. It like gives you more energy than you actually put in, right?
Yeah.
Certain like relationships can be an example of that. If they're good relationship friendships, right? Things like that. They should be mutual and they grow for both people. And so,
So that is so well said, and I
yeah.
completely agree.
Yeah, and then fitness is one of those. The more energy you put into it, the more it gives back, right? And there's very few true positive reinforcement loops that exist in the world. And so like, I think that alone is just like it's like investing in stocks or something over time. It's the same thing, you know what I mean? But it's your body, it's your vessel to do everything else. Like your body is your vehicle for action in the world.
Well, one thing that I think is remarkable about your journey in fitness is that this is more than a hobby for you. I mean, this was borderline a profession. Can you talk about what it was like to be a professional bodybuilder and what the life of somebody like that actually looks like on the day to day?
Yeah, so when I left, I got really into bodybuilding and like made the decision that I wanted to get into bodybuilding when I was in Afghanistan because I worked out a lot when I was in Afghanistan. There's like really
Yeah.
nothing else to do. I mean, I wrestled through high school, right, with you, right? So I started then, right? But so I'd already been lifting for 6, 7 years, something like that. Decided to get into bodybuilding, decided to move to California where that's like really like the center of bodybuilding. And I had a good friend from the military who lived in Orange County. So that kind of gave me a really good landing spot. The daily life, it sucks. I mean, what I quickly learned was that it's suffering. Yeah. The judges reward suffering. You know what I mean? And they can tell who like really put the work in because like when you're at a deficit for a really long period of time, like being at a deficit when you're lower in body fat is a stronger hunger feeling than when you're higher in body fat.
Interesting. So, like me sitting here today, if I feel like I'm hungry
Yeah.
versus maybe when you felt you were hungry, they are different feelings.
Yeah, a 500 calorie deficit, or let's say 1,000 calorie deficit in a day at 20% body fat is different than at 4% body fat or 6% body fat, especially when you've been doing it for a long time. And so I always say that I think bodybuilding is actually one of the hardest sports because you do just as much training as any other sport, but you do it with no food.
So you literally force yourself to suffer probably more than almost any other sport.
Yeah.
Honestly, probably more than any other sport.
Yeah, I'd say besides maybe like martial arts, I'd put martial arts over it. Maybe, like UFC.
Do you think that the end result, meaning your physique and being able to have those photos taken of you be on that stage, did it justify the suffering or did it not make sense
Absolutely.
for you at a certain point?
No, what you realize is it's delayed gratification. And that was one of the reasons why I liked the sport so much was because I realized it was like the most manifest way that I could conquer, my issues with delayed gratification. Because I felt like growing up, I was a very ADD kind of kid that struggles with instant gratification.
Absolutely.
And so this was like the sport of delayed gratification.
I can imagine the discipline that something like that instills in you.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the military definitely helped with that. And like wrestling, I think wrestling did a good job. Yeah.
I've had out of body and look, I wasn't even that good, right? But I've had like out of body experiences in wrestling rooms, right? Where
Dude,
it's like really sweaty, you're
bro.
wearing a trash bag, trying to lose weight. It's like a hell on earth.
Oh, yeah.
What I love, even more than all of this about you and what I've come to learn over time is that despite you being like this, masculine dude and this like physical force of nature, you are so exceptionally well read. And especially in one area that I think is becoming more and more prevalent today, but I think a lot of people are curious about but don't know a lot about. And that's actually the history of the church. And that's what I want to spend some time talking about today because I'm somebody who is curious, but underinformed. Let's put it that way.
Mhm.
But you have read a lot on this, including a lot of source material. So let's just start here, man. Like, what got you interested, not only in like religion, but in the actual history of the institution itself?
Yeah, well, so my dad's a priest, right? So I kind of have that very specific upbringing, right? And my older brother's a physics teacher, and he's working on his master's in divinity right now. So he's like going
Wow.
through all this stuff too, right? And then my little brother has a bachelor's in biblical studies from Gordon, which is like 20 minutes from Harvard or something. It's like a really, really good school too. So like I really like my family is like very hyper intellectual. So I grew up talking about this stuff, like debate about all of this, like was very, very common in my family. And my dad was really good about like not shying away from hard questions. He had a very clear philosophy of, I'd rather teach you how to be a Christian in the world than, hide you from the world. And so he's like, the world is how it is. And he's real. He gets how life is. He didn't exactly have like the easiest upbringing at all,
Right.
and is very much a self-made man. And so like
Yeah.
I have a ton of respect for my dad, like, more than anyone. That was the kind of almost frustrating thing growing up was that like my dad and my mom, they balanced each other out really well. But my dad was so rational all the time with how he like laid down parental guidance, however you want to call it. But yeah, my dad was so rational about everything that it was like I knew he was right all the time. So it's like I wanted to
Okay.
rebel, you know what I mean? But he was like so good at like showing me that like it wasn't the right train of thought. And so like it was great. I had a great dad, you know what I mean? And I was blessed, absolutely blessed to have that. So like it was hard for me to rebel against the church, and whenever people would talk like super negative about the institution or anything, it's like I have this great example. So
100%. I'm sure that like if people talk bad about the church, you'd be like, "Well, look at this example of somebody in my life that kind of in my mind almost like represents the church in my
a little bit,
life." And
yeah.
this is, you know what I mean? And this is to me like a good role model. This
But
is
it
something that I like.
But it definitely did present a struggle, which was that, like, how am I supposed to know if I truly believe in Christianity or if I just, like, really respect my dad?
What an internal debate that must have
Yeah,
been for you at the time. Like, is this just me loving my father, or is there something more here that's like
yeah.
bigger than
How am I
us?
supposed to know? And
Yeah.
so, like, at a certain point, like, pretty much right when I moved to California, this actually kinda lands us really well. I didn't really get it for a little bit, and I hadn't put as much thought into it, I think, as I thought I did. And I was like, "Dad, I don't really consider myself Christian. I'm just gonna, like, party really hard." So I, like
I feel like California will do that too.
Yeah, for sure. And so I loved the rave scene and like going to raves and stuff like that. Got into party drugs and stuff, had some crazy experiences there for sure, which for some reason, like that's a whole long story. But shot me right back to Jesus. Like, I never had a strong angst against it. Like the typical I grew up with a lot of like asking my dad hard questions about the church, and then he would have a great answer for it. And I'd be like, oh,
Yeah.
okay. So like stuff about like, oh, the Vatican and like, oh, like all this other weird stuff. Like I get kind of what's going on there, and there are some real issues with the Vatican and things that have happened in the past. It's not like it's perfect. And it's not
Right.
like the history of the church is perfect. There's definitely been imperfect people who are Christians. Like, I'm not perfect. That's the whole thing. No one's perfect, right?
And so at what point did you start like taking this really seriously? Like at what point did you decide, okay, I need to actually dive into this,
So,
in a way that I haven't before?
well, so I think what happened to me because I had such a specific upbringing is maybe God kind of like used this outside of normal thing of psychedelics to kind of push me back and show
Mm.
me, really put in my face like, hey, the spiritual world is real.
Well, I
Like
want to hear
it's
about
very
this because
real.
you've had experiences that, not everybody has had. And so I'm very curious
Well,
what you mean by
I've just
this.
done way too much acid, so yeah.
But
But
it feels to me like you've had experiences
yeah.
with the spiritual
But
realm,
I've
let's just
but
say.
I've had sober experiences, do you know what I mean? And, like, I've kinda undermined myself saying that and opening it up that way because my childhood was, like, full of, like, a lot of really weird spiritual experiences in my family, like, all the time. Like, spiritual experience was not, like, something that I wasn't awake to at all. Like, I grew up with an understanding of a spirit world and everything like that. It's just I did psychedelics and I was like, "Oh, like, I can see it."
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Which is
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
different. But, like, I have weird stories, like, my dog got run over when I was in, like, high school. He's a little Pomeranian. He got run over by both wheels of an SUV. My dad carries him into the backyard, prays over him, and then he starts like, and like they were all sure he was dead. And I know this kind of sounds sad, but it's gonna get happy in a second.
Okay.
Um, they brought him into the back, they start praying over him, and then my dad, like, kinda says this big part of the prayer, like, "In the name of Jesus, like, get up." And then my dog opens his eyes, starts moving his eyes around, licking his lips, trying to fix his back, and his back was all, like, like,
Oh
not
my
full. Yeah,
goodness.
and it starts trying to fix his back and stuff, like, trying to get up, can't get up. Anyway, they bring him to the vet, and they do a bunch of scans and everything, and they go, "Oh, he has 1 broken leg," and that
Oh
was
my
it.
goodness. That's it?
Yeah, and then he lived to be 14.
That's
Yeah.
like that is a real life example of what somebody would call like a
Yeah,
miracle.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, like, I believe in miracles. And then my dad has stories throughout his whole, like, experience as a priest of, like, all these little weird things, and so, like, I grew up with, like, hearing all these little stories and stuff, and I trust my dad. He's not a bullshit kinda guy at all. He's a very, like, rational, like, scientifically minded, like, loves neuroscience and, like, he knows his stuff, he's a smart guy.
It's funny, man. So as you look back on the readings you've done in the history of the church, like, are there any certain like periods of time or certain individuals that you
Yeah,
find like really
the
interesting to
first
learn
500
about or to
years.
speak about?
The first
Yeah,
500
like
years.
what kind of happened?
Right after Jesus, so Jesus gets crucified, they put him into the tomb. 3 days go by, they come back, they find the tomb empty. They find the cloth, right? That's important because I'm going to come back to that. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Shroud of
Okay,
Turin.
of course I've heard of the Shroud
Okay,
of Turin.
that in my mind, big mic drop from God.
And where is it right now? Where
I
is it?
forget. I'm gonna mess that up, but it is
Because
preserved. Yeah,
I think it bounces around. I was
yeah,
recently at the Vatican. I went to Rome, and I was in St. Peter's Basilica, and they have several. I think they have a piece of the cross.
yeah.
I think they have maybe the spear that was used to poke Jesus when he was being crucified.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have several actual items from that day, and I thought they may have had that as well, but I
Yeah.
know it bounces around.
Yeah, no, it's all laid out. You can see where it is. It's not hidden, but it was a coveted item for a while, especially during
Yeah.
like the Crusades and stuff. A lot of relics were destroyed during those times on purpose. Like the true cross is a great example of that. We used to have the full true cross, the cross that Jesus was crucified on, and they carried
I
it
never knew
around.
that.
Yeah, they carried it around in battle, like during like the Crusades era.
That is so badass.
Yeah, yeah. It's like they
But
used to carry.
but it was destroyed.
Yeah, they lost a battle at one point, and it's sad, but, yeah. But you can still there's still
Yeah.
some pieces that survived, so you can find pieces. There's certain people and places that have pieces of the true cross. It's funny, like, people debate, they're like, "Oh, Jesus wasn't real," or whatever. It's like, dude, you like, no serious historian debates that he was a real person, crucified, buried. No one debates that. Like, no
No, 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 no.
serious.
I think that's a well-known fact.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then you have the cascading events that happened afterwards. So then it's a grassroots change in authority in the biggest empire of the world, in the Roman Empire.
You're
Like,
exactly right.
right? And so like you have Christianity just spreading by word of mouth essentially, and miracles, because there's a lot of miracles that were going on. But the next couple 100 years was a very bad time where a lot of Christians were eventually pretty much like tortured and killed. The Romans used to like put on this public sacrifices. Yeah, you'd have to do public sacrifices and like bring something to sacrifice, and you'd get marked if you did your sacrifice. And so if you weren't
Mm.
marked for doing your public sacrifice, then you'd get pulled in by the authorities, and then they'd ask you why you're not marked, why didn't you do your sacrifice, and you'd have to say I'm a Christian. But like so pretty much during that time before Christianity was made legal, it was persecuted super heavily, right? And so like all those people were tortured, and there's like crazy miracles that you can read about, like stuff that happened, like a lot of weird stuff. You can read a bunch of books. There's a lot of people who like just won't read anything other than the Bible, which I think is funny
Well, that's
personally.
actually funny. Let me
Yeah,
just say, I'm one of those people, not by choice,
yeah,
deliberately, but because that's kind of all that I know. Like, okay, what Christian text should I read? It's that.
yeah.
But it sounds to me, and one thing I've learned from you is there's so much outside of
There's
that
so
that like
much.
is so useful to the faith that if you don't know about it, you're doing yourself a disservice by
Yeah,
not being able to contextualize this stuff.
yeah. The Bible is the authority, right? But where did that authority come from? Like you're giving it authority. Who put it together? right? The church existed for 300 years, 350 years before the Bible existed. And then the Bible was, everyone was writing to each other. A lot of stuff was happening. You had the Jewish war from, 70 to 100 AD or whatever. You had like, and then you had like all these persecutions. You had a bunch of stuff going on, right? And it was really a big upheaval and shift of frame on like how people viewed the world, right? And personally, I would put all that on Pentecost, right? So when Jesus, like, so he starts appearing to everyone, he appears to the 500, right? Different
Yep.
people right after. And then he's talking to one of the disciples, I forget which one, but right before he goes up into the sky, he says, the Spirit of truth is with you, right? That's Pentecost, right? The Holy Spirit is with you, right? I'll be back, but you have the Holy Spirit with you. So people take that like in the modern day, like when they're just reading the Bible, they use that essentially to say, make a sola scriptura argument that like the Spirit of truth is given to all faithful believers. So the body that the church is all faithful believers, right? And it's not the institution. That's their major claim against Catholicism. So this is now we're talking
Mm-hmm.
Protestant Reformation. So I'm jumping forward a bunch. You have this grassroots change of frame, right, in the populace, which is because Jesus says you have the Spirit of truth with you, right? My word is truth. We now have words and moral code to say is objective and universally real because it came from God himself, proven by all the miracles and the prophecies, etc., from the Old Testament. So he meets all these criteria, right, to be the Messiah in a lot of ways, not exactly how they expect, and then uses all these instances of interactions with people, of demonstrations of faith, of demonstrations of lack of faith, to essentially make like a bucket of all the possible moral interactions, essentially, and then give the proper response to all of them. And so
Right. So
he's
not only does he say it, he also does it.
yeah, yeah, exactly. He's like giving practicality, like actually, he's the word, right? He is literally God's word made flesh. And so it's literally everything he's doing, everything he's saying is literally like God's word interacting with like us. So like the whole point of Christianity is that Jesus is the key that unlocks all the doors everywhere properly. Or you check the door and it opens it if it's supposed to, it closes it if it's not. And
Yes.
it's the master
Yes.
key, it's the master perfect key. I think people are hesitant to read other people in that era outside of the Bible because they don't see it as Jesus. Like, what's the point? I need to be just spending all my time reading what Jesus said, which I agree is great. I personally like history. I don't think you need to like understand exactly what happened in the first 300 years or exactly what happened in the Crusades to be a Christian necessarily. Like I think you can just read the Bible and be a good Christian, and understand it and stuff. But I do think that God wanted a community, and that's why he had the Last Supper.
Perfect example of that.
Like I think people completely miss the utility of the church and what the church functioned as for most of for especially the first 1,000 years, because a lot of people when they're critiquing the church and the history of the church, they're critiquing the last 1,000 years and primarily
Mm.
Catholicism and everything that happened with Catholicism. But Catholicism and Orthodoxy broke off in 1054, right? And so there's the great schism between the Orthodox and Catholic. The church was one unified church with no denominational separations for the first 1,000 years. And you have all these ecumenical councils where you have all these bishops from different areas coming together, talking about what they're teaching, and then debating on specific questions that come up from the people, how the word is interacting with the religions of the area that they're interacting with. Hey, these people are saying this stuff. What do we say about it? And then at these ecumenical councils, you have people that have very, very close ties to the apostles, right? They're only like a generation away, right?
So
So
true. Some of them, like their
they
grandparents,
they literally
knew
knew
them
him.
or were
Yeah,
them.
yeah, and exactly. So you have like, all these people who have overlapping lives, who knew the apostles and knew this stuff, and you're only like 3, 4 generations over the course of like you can stretch that of like I met him when I was young and then I know this person when I'm old who's young. And you can do that and you have like you only need like 3 people and you span 300 years, right? Or almost,
Yeah.
right? And so it's like people forget like that's not that much time, and they think it's like completely lost and it's like you're not even looking at anything that was written then. And the other thing is when you start to read these people and like take the time to actually read a book from 300, right? Is it's like they were smart. They were really smart. Like
Yeah.
you're sitting on your phone watching reels all day. Like
Yeah.
you know what I mean? And like Netflix and shit. These guys all they did was read and write. And so like they're really smart. You know what I mean? Like we have this thing, this fallacy of thinking that like, the farther back we go, the dumber they are. It's like, yeah, no, what I would argue, and this is kind of my own idea, is that like Plato was starting to wrestle with this idea of objectivity. Right. And we really didn't have any strong philosophical rigor or framework to make objective universal claims like about the universe. Right. I'd be willing to bet that if you went back to like Plato's era, like if you tried to make any objective claims about the whole world or how everything worked or something like that, like you'd be laughed at. Haha, who are you? This man thinks he's Adonis, like this man
Right,
thinks he's
right.
Hercules, right? Nowadays, we can point to papers. I can point to peer review. I can point to the scientific method. And those things are saying, hey, there's an objective outside world that's informing the subjective that we can measure, and replicate and agree on. And then that's what object permanence is.
Yes.
Like if you're going to deny that, you're just denying object permanence, which is like literally like one of the first things you develop as a baby.
Right.
And so it's like people making this like moral subjectivity argument, or like to me it's like, okay, you're making a universal statement saying that morality can be subjective.
And your point of view on that would be it can't be,
It
because
can't be.
we have an objective framework to view it through.
Well, what I would really say is both exist. There's such thing as a subjective perspective, and there's such thing as an objective reality. And you're always operating on limited information relative to the entire universe, but the universe informs the subjective and gives you data to analyze, compartmentalize, and act on.
Yeah.
It's a bounce. It's a wave like this, right? And then people make the mistake of thinking that like, because I have an effect on the world, you know what I mean? Or like because all I have is the limited data I have, the only conclusions I could possibly make are within the bounds of that I don't know, or that I think I know, of what's
Understood.
subjective.
Completely understood.
And so if you're saying that morality is subjective, or that these things are subjective and that's all there is, you're just denying everything you don't know.
Which is a fairly naive worldview.
It's called
I would say.
narcissism, if I'm gonna be real.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
Roger
and
that.
I won't say
Under-
that, you know what I mean? And like and so like that's why I like push against it a little bit, and that's why like that's literally the whole Bible is like the Old Testament is God saying, hey, like there's such thing as good and bad objectively, and
Right.
that's why it's very harsh in the Old Testament. God's like, no, like bad.
I think some people, take certain qualms with those parts of the Bible, and I think they say he's being too harsh. This, a just, loving God would not do these things. What would be your rebuttal to an argument like that?
I think that God is proportionately ambiguous to the agnostic as their agnosticism. If I want space from God, God's going to give me space. If I want to do this thing, God's going to let me do the thing. Now, is my will going to maybe interact with your will, and your will can be conflicting of mine and righteous, right? And then is God going to deem you, like make you overcome me? Probably. I would hope so. And that's why all the good stories are stories of good conquering evil. But God gave us free will, you know what I mean? So that we're not just robots, you know what I mean? Like that's our most godlike quality that we share with him. When we're made in God's image, it's because, we're given free will and the ability to create and produce, out of nothing, right? I can just think of art and create art.
I've heard an argument made such that if God threw a stone and the stone was conscious, imagine humans, then the stone itself might not realize that it was thrown by God because it came into consciousness after it was thrown. It has the illusion of free will, but it's not actually moving in a way that it sets out to move. What would your argument be against something like that?
Okay, this actually kind of connects to what I just said, which is that like no matter what, okay, I can create art, but I'm using paint. I didn't make paint. Like I didn't make the ground. You know what I mean? Like I'm working within the laws of nature that God gave, but God didn't create the laws of nature in a way that limits my free will ultimately. I would say there are boundaries to free will, but I wouldn't
Completely.
say, like I obvious in the sense that I literally can't just stretch my arm out 12 feet, You know what I mean?
Right. There
So,
are
like,
bounds to this.
obviously, there are bounds to things, right? And that's how we classify anything in the first place. And
Yeah.
so, like, there's bounds to things. And so, but I have free will within those bounds. I can choose to go get up and go to the gym tomorrow. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Or I can choose not to. And then that has an effect. The cool thing is that God made our body both really sensitive and really resilient at the same time, which is real and complex. So, like, those 3 things balancing, you almost never find all 3 of those together in nature, right? Resilient, complex, and sensitive. So it can intake different types of information at large and small frequencies. Think of a computer with sensors, right? But now I want more sensitivity. Oh, I can't think of a rock doing all those things, but I can think of a computer doing all those things. Oh, I had to move complexity up.
Yep.
But now resiliency's down, right? Because I moved away from the rock, right? And so you get to play with those 3 things: resiliency, complexity, and sensitivity. And then you can have a system that's growing in those 3 things or shrinking in those 3 things. And all 3 of those could be growing or shrinking. And that could be through
I was
time.
going to ask, are those mutually exclusive, or no, they can all grow
No, they
in
could all,
parallel?
but like but like the bigger changes you're gonna make, the more you're also playing with like frequency and rarity. You know what I mean? Just based on,
Mm,
and this is just observations, right? This is just me looking at rocks and looking at tables and the energy that it takes to, like, I have to put a lot more energy into something that's more of those 3 things. And then that energy can
absolutely.
come in the form of time. That energy can come in the form of, money, which is condensed time. And so,
I've heard that before,
yeah.
and it is true. Right, the exchange of money really is nothing more than the exchange of time.
I would say, like, time and influence, yeah,
So
or
this is
whatever.
fascinating
I
to
don't
me,
know.
and some
I'm
of it
not a
is over
money
my
guy.
head, right?
Yeah.
No, you're not,
I don't like money at all. I don't care about money at all. Like, I wish I liked money more, but I don't.
dude. I'm jealous. Well, it's hard to not at least care about money when you live in New York City and you have to pay like
Yeah.
extortionate prices for
Yeah.
everything.
I mean,
But
I'm in Orange County. You definitely gotta be, like, good at something to survive out here, you know? Um,
yeah, well, there you go.
but everyone out here is so money oriented. It's kind of like, I don't need to make $1,000,000, you know? Like, I don't need
Yeah.
to, I'd much rather have a happy family, that, and just
Well,
pay bills and not have to worry about food, you know?
that is an extremely refreshing perspective, and one that I'm happy to have had on the show, because I feel like at least on for specifically with respect to like my own social media feeds, like that's not necessarily a message that I see being pushed actively today. I feel like I see the opposite being pushed to me, which is grind, build wealth, have a legacy, do this and that. And I want to do all those things, but I also am trying much harder to just fall back on the idea that like I don't
Yeah.
necessarily have to be a billionaire to live a righteous life.
One what I think I looked at some point was, I looked at what all of the top winners in any field did after they won.
And what were the results?
What they do after they won. So it's like all the
Yeah.
bodybuilders, like what they do after they won 5 times. Like, now where do they put that energy? That's something. It's like, okay, now I've won, I've gained all this experience. Like, what do you choose to do when you have all the experience, you won, you did everything? And then they usually get a lot simpler, or they like become some multi-billionaire in like a bunch of different, fields or whatever. They like just continue that growth, exponentially, something like that. But I think,
100%.
but a lot of them get a lot simpler. It's one of those too. And I don't know. I feel like growing up in Connecticut, like, around a lot of old money, I saw a lot of rich people who weren't happy, and I had a great family life, and like,
Yep.
we didn't have that money. So like I was like, well, then that's not, the thing I need to worry that much
That can't
about.
be the sole thing. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, no. And then I really,
Yeah.
like, resonated with the Christian idea of fullness of life instead of, like, happiness, like, the idea is
Can you explain what that means, just so I can understand? What do you mean by
fullness
that?
fullness of life. It's like, you see those, I've seen, like, kinda cheesy memes around or something where it's like, stop and smell the roses, and, like, it's like all the simple things, right? It's like, the best way I think I could put it, or the way I think about it personally, is it's like, A, not taking for granted all the different ranges of emotion and human experiences people can have. You have art that's tragic and super sad, but it's like the best film ever. And
Yes.
it's like, and like, it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. Like, there's a reason that's a saying. I read this really good book called Suffering and Evil in Early Christian Thought, which was like
Mm.
going through how, like, the early church thought about suffering and evil, and how there's like a right and a wrong frame or perspective on, like, how to approach different bad things that can happen. And their reference, and this is, keep in mind, a time when they're heavily persecuted. So everyone's getting murdered, like, everyone's like getting families torn apart, like, you know what I mean, tortured, just for being Christian, right? This is like definitely a thing. Then you have writings from these people talking about how great God is, you know?
Even despite those other things.
Yeah, and they're dying with a smile on their face and stuff, like, there's all these accounts of them being, like, laughing and making jokes while they're, like, burning alive and stuff because they're like, "Ha like, God is good, I'm going to heaven, dude," like, their faith was strong, man, like, you gotta think, like, if that was the in my mind, if that was how strong their faith was, like, if those stories are true, and there's just too many of them to discount, you know, there's just way too many books on this topic, and, like, inside the church, the amount of old dudes I've met who've have, like, 100 times more books read than I have on this subject, and, to
Yeah.
me, like, I'm such a rabbit hole person, you know, like, I love rabbit holes, like, that's why I like The Body, again, is another one because it's, like, such a rabbit hole, you could, like, learn so much about it. The church is such a rabbit hole, dude, like, you could just there's so much, and, like, when you realize that, like, not everyone was bad, and, you also realize that when you write it, it's like they're putting so much effort in their writing to, like, be as precisely loving as possible and, like, really figure out, like, what is it with people that creates evil, they're just trying so hard to tackle that problem, you know what I mean? It's, like, you when you actually read them instead of, like, just listening to someone else talk about it, it's like, "Oh, dude, like, this guy, like, was really
Well,
thinking
that's why it's
about
so
this."
fascinating that you've gone back to the source material. Like
Yeah.
you don't read accounts, you don't hear this word of mouth from others. You actually like read what these people from 300, 400, 600 actually wrote
Mhm.
themselves because
Mhm.
these texts are preserved if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, very well, very well, and, like,
Yeah.
people will
And are
debate
they
that, but
translated into modern English or is this something
yeah.
very hard for you to like
Yeah,
decipher?
like, that's a really common, like, misnomer, like, you know, people say, like, "Oh, the translations are bad." Dude, like, we have millions of manuscripts, millions, and we have hundreds of thousands translated. We have the Septuagint, which is, you know, Greek Old Test pretty much like the Greek Old Testament that was, I think it has both Greek and Hebrew in it, so it, like, translates it. We just have so much, dude. If you actually no one really debates this stuff. You'll hear internet comment trolls and stuff talking about it and stuff. They just go bring up like any of these authors, like bring up Eusebius or bring up Saint Maximus or Ignatius or Irenaeus or Athanasius or something like that. Saint Basil, Saint Gregory of Nyssa. You bring up any of these people and they go, and then there's archaeological discoveries that have come out in the last like 30 years and 40 years that have like strengthened like their cities that we didn't know that we thought were myth that we found out were real because they were in the Bible. Like, I thought we thought they were mythical cities in the Bible, like, they were just fables, and then we found the remains, and we're like, "Oh, this is actually a real city," and it, like, matches up perfectly in the timeline, you know, like
I
yeah.
never knew that.
We
Really?
found we found we're pretty sure we know where Sodom and Gomorrah is now, and there's literally, like, sulfur balls in the ground everywhere, like, there's so much stuff, dude, that it's like, and then on top of that's the logical side of it, and then there's the very real emotional and spiritual and personal, like, side of it, where, like, I know how I used to see things and how I used to see the world, and understanding how Christ went about things and what happened, what that led to and how it shifted thought, you know, at the highest levels of philosophy from before and after and how it echoed into history, you know what I mean? Like, just, and then just the stories are beautiful, man. It's, like, about God loving you so much that, like, he doesn't want you to go to hell for, like, the shit you did, you know what I mean? And, like, you know what you did, you know what I mean? Like, everyone knows, like, everyone's done shitty stuff, you know? And so it's
100%, man.
if you're gonna just walk around saying you've never done anything shitty or, I'd just say you haven't been granular about it, you know? You haven't, like, looked that hard, like, I mean, you know, maybe you're a wonderful person, awesome. I don't think that God is like, this is one place I think I'd stray a little bit from, like, traditional, like, Orthodox teaching, which would be that, like, I think God is very merciful, is I think merciful is a very small word in reality,
Mm,
you know what I mean? And,
mm.
like, he's actually a lot more merciful than we think, you know? And I like to make this analogy, it's like, imagine like, if I asked you if I could punch you in the face as hard as I could right now, like, full swing, like, as hard as I possibly could, you'd probably say no, right?
I would for sure say no.
Yeah, yeah. If I said I'd give you $1,000,000 afterwards,
I would be more inclined to say
100 mil
yes. Let's put
$100
it that
million
way.
dollars, $100,000,000,000.
I would say
Yeah,
absolutely.
exactly. Okay, so, like, I think we underestimate how good God is in, like, relative to the pain we go through and the experiences we can have, and I think we blame God a lot, you know what I mean, on things that we do, you know, with our free will that we asked for. I
I
asked
I
You know, for
I
separation from God, that means I ask to not know what the right thing is at a moment, you know, so that I could see myself as the sole judge of what's good and bad.
That is so unbelievably well said. I think the word merciful is a loaded word, and I think it might get interpreted in the wrong way because mercy doesn't always look like immediately getting what you ask for
Exactly, yeah.
or being immediately forgiven for something that you've done.
We forget that we're mind, body, and soul. We're not just a body. We're eternal beings. I really believe that. Like, I really
Yeah.
believe that we are an eternal soul and that we have the wrong perspective a lot and that we're thinking of things. And that was one of the large things Jesus was talking about was like, you guys are thinking of things like you're like this is all that matters and that you have no generations after you and you don't have people around you that are affected by your actions and you know your actions don't make perturbations in the world that are negative and more far reaching than you see. And so it's you know, he's trying to communicate that. And I think we a lot of our pain is in that frame, you know, and I think that can sound cold, and I get that. I understand, you know, but in a way, I think it allows space for new.
I completely understand what you're saying.
Yeah, and that's, you know, that could be beautiful, and me personally, I don't think I could ask everyone to do this where they're sitting right now, but, like, I trust God in those things that I don't see, you know what I mean? And I think that's one of the things I've just, like, I've tried to practice in my thought patterns and, like, my life a lot more over the last few years is, like especially after, like, kinda, like, recovering from doing too much acid and everything, that took a little bit, you know, I feel
Yeah.
great now, I'm, like, honestly in, like, one of the best headspaces I've been in now for, like, a couple of years, thank God, you know?
Good
Sober, all
for
that
you,
kinda
man.
s sober, all that kinda stuff, you know? So, like
Well, let me ask you this
yeah.
because, and here's an area where I'd love to kind of like put a fine point on and maybe start to sort of like, I don't know, drive this to something that's even so relevant to people today because I feel like, especially so in 2024. Tell me if you would agree or disagree, but I feel like more than ever, people are facing what I would call a crisis of meaning and a crisis of purpose. And I don't know if that's driven by a lack of faith or the overstimulation that we get, but would you agree that, today people are having a harder time connecting to something deeper than themselves than maybe they ever have?
Absolutely. I mean, like, I think having a frame at least of like something bigger than yourself is really important, right? And I don't think the government should be that.
Yeah, well, for
Uh,
some people it is, unfortunately.
yeah, and but you know, I think in part it's a lack of mentors. You know, I don't think there's been a lot of mentors for our generation, for younger kids, like who are older, really stepped up and you know, said put their foot down, said no, bad. I don't think there's been enough of that. And I also think dopamine is a real problem. I think we're genuinely in a more toxic environment, literally, than we were 50 years ago as a country. I think that that's one of the I'm like not a big Trump guy to be honest. Like I don't love the cult of personality. I'll meme it hard. Like I think it's really funny to joke about Trump and like,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know, be like super conservative over the top. It's mostly a meme to me. Like generally I'm actually like way more like really reality I'm like way more down the middle in my mind I think on most things except for like a couple of things I definitely lean a bit more right for sure but I'm not a huge Trump guy. I don't really trust him 100%. He's been too close to all the other sticky people for too long, you know, that I'm not just gonna like wipe him clean, you know, for no reason. But I do hope RFK does a good job. You know, I'm really hoping RFK isn't also just like royalty family, you know what I mean? And like just
I
good
think a
at
lot of people share that fear, but I
yeah.
also think there's a lot of hope from people that like, hey, we're going to
There's
have some actual change
There's been
in
some good people for, like, the
institutions.
USDA and stuff like that, you know, I liked who he put in for the USDA and, like, I do think the FDA and all those, like, the USDA, they need to be redone because they aren't working as they're supposed to right now, and they need to be redone. It's just like, how do they do it, right? I'm still waiting for him to do it well, you know? I
Yeah,
don't want him
yeah.
to tear it down and then, you know, just put up other bad people, you know, that would suck. So, like,
Right.
I'm
Well,
still waiting for them to do this all well, you know? A lot of people promise a lot on campaigns.
and we'll see how it actually turns out.
Yeah,
But I do
yeah.
feel like there has been some like there it feels to me like there is somewhat of a cultural renaissance happening right
Yeah,
now, and it does feel like we are trending as a nation slightly back towards faith
yeah.
and back towards some of the values that maybe we lost.
Well
And I don't think that should be politicized. I feel like that should
yeah.
exist external to left or right.
And actually, yeah, I can relate that to the church a lot actually because, you know, I think people criticize tradition a lot, as it's like old ways and stuff like that. But I think the whole point of
Yeah.
tradition is giving you something rock solid that lasts and is stable in hard times, right? And it's when hard times come and there's a lot more chaos that people return to tradition and a stable, repetitive, structure full of symbols that represent the core of the culture.
Well, that's what I felt like I was, I feel like you're speaking right to me because that's what I personally felt like, when faith was not a part of my life at all. I felt like I was lacking that foundation. Like when things were getting rocky, even like with this show, like I really had nothing existentially to lean on as like, okay, fundamentally,
Yeah.
like this is my rock.
Yeah. I think we're
Um,
communal beings, dude, and that's why church is important. People criticize the church and they say my faith is mine alone. Okay. I don't think that's the worst thing ever, but I also think that humans are communal beings. And, I've had some really sad days where I went to church and I bawled my eyes out at church and there's nowhere else that
mm,
I'd rather cry. And and I felt that in that moment, and that stuck with me, and it's like, I think that community, that bedrock, and maybe I don't hang out with them all the time, you know what I mean, or something like that, and maybe I don't think they're, like, the coolest always, you know?
yeah.
But do I know that I can show up there and cry my eyes out when my girlfriend breaks up with me or something? Absolutely.
That's got to be one of the most important safe spaces that anybody could possibly have is a community of people that believe,
Yeah,
that believe together and that
yeah,
share space and
yeah.
worship.
And you go and you get reminded of ultimate hope and God conquering death and all these other people before you who've gone through other hard things, because the history is a very important part of the church, especially the traditional or, the apostolic church, the
I want to ask you this, man, and maybe as we start to close, I think this is a really important question that I could not think of a better person to ask than you on this. And I'm curious to hear your opinion. I hear a lot of people tell me that they are faithful but not religious. Um, and I wonder what your general opinion is on that. What does that mean? And why are people hesitant to say that they prescribe to a religion? Let's say in this case, Christianity. Like, why don't people want to buy in, but they seem to dip their toe into the idea that there's something bigger out there? They just don't want to name it.
yeah. Well, I think that a lot of that has to do with kind of some of the abuse of power by the Catholic Church over time, which is very
Yeah,
real and
that's a fair take.
has definitely happened, and so then they see religion as these overarching institutions that have been legalistic and domineering and tyrannical and stuff like that, and there have definitely been periods of that. I would definitely say that's not the historical church at large globally, you know what I mean?
I
And
agree.
people put too much fault on the whole thing and Jesus and all that on just some things that the Catholic Church did, in over a couple hundred years in a certain part of the globe, right? And
Yeah.
so there's that, and then so people don't wanna, say I'm religious, and then, spirituality, I think everyone can kind of, agree, that there's some sort of spiritual reality to the universe, but my dad always said that religion is just practiced spirituality, and so if you practice a spirituality, you're religious. You just don't know what religion you are, technically.
So in a way, these two things are like kind of one and the same.
Yeah, like, if you're gonna be spiritual, it's kind of like a funny term, funny to say that you're spiritual, not religious. It's like, okay, well, do you practice your spirituality? No? Then okay, whatever. If you do, then it's like, then you just, technically, it's not like you invented that, dude. Like, this is a conversation that's been going on for thousands of years. Like, you're not the first person to think of whatever you're thinking of religiously, and so, someone's named it already, someone's done it,
Yeah, you're
like, you're
so
not
right.
new, and I think there's a lot of people, just starting to get into this, and, there's some people who talk about it and whatever, but, people think they're saying new stuff, and they're just not, Like,
Yeah.
so many of
Well,
these were, debated in the first few hundred years.
and have they been definitively have they and it sounds like they've been answered.
They've been debated very, very well, to the point where no one brings it up anymore for 1,000 years or whatever, or maybe it takes, 600 years for someone to be like, "Hey, what if we thought about it this way?" But, you know,
Yeah,
uh,
oh, yeah.
like
Yeah. Yeah, completely, bro. Look, I actually want to close on this, and this is kind of off topic, but it's actually kind of not. And I'm really curious to hear your take on it. Super topical, something I've never talked about on the show before. Aliens,
Yeah.
okay? And this connects, right? This does connect. And so I'm curious what your general take is on the existence of, let's say, extraterrestrials, and if that conflicts with your own faith.
Well, I definitely lean on the side of it being a spiritual thing,
Okay?
what we're experiencing or what everyone's talking about. I think that some of the in terms of, UFOs and UAPs and stuff like that, I think a lot of that's our own,
Exactly.
to be honest. I think we figured out anti-gravity in like the 60s or 70s. And it went black like right after the Manhattan Project. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Philadelphia experiment.
No, I haven't, but I'd
No,
love to learn
you should
about it
look up
right
to the
now.
Philadelphia experiment. So pretty much they were like, the government was trying to work on cloaking for the Navy ships, and
Mm-hmm.
the story goes, the ship completely disappeared from the port it was on, and it was like a battleship, like it was a big ship, disappears, and then sometime later, like 30 minutes later or something like that, reappears on the other side of the bay with all the crew members melted inside the doors, like melted into the walls. Everyone was dead. And then there's a guy who a guy who survived, who like gave a story and said that pretty much like he went into the future, he met people, they sent him back.
This was when? What year was this in?
I forget. I think this is I want to say the 50s or something. It's after nukes. It's after we developed the nuke. There was a lot of research that went into anti-gravity after they developed the sciences for nukes, and then all of that suddenly went black, and they stopped researching it. They're like, "Oh, nothing here. Never mind. Let's think about other stuff." And then so
And
a
your
lot.
theory is that it was solved and
I
then
mean,
swept
I'm
and then
getting this
kept
from
quiet.
other people. It's not like I have inside knowledge on this, you know what I mean? But I think that clicks, that like makes sense to me, that because I like math. I've like looked up. I've had an interest in math for a long time. My older brother's a physics teacher. I've read like a couple books on like the history of math and stuff like
Yeah.
that. And so like I'm not totally unaware. I don't have the best math grammar, but I think it checks out. But yeah, so the Philadelphia experiment's really wild. And I think that, and then I believe in Roswell. I think that was real. I think we've been in contact for a long time, and then some of it's ours, some of it's theirs. I think what's been going on lately, like all the stuff in Florida, like at the mall, and the other crash behind that. Did you see the video of the crash?
I know the
Behind
crash
the
you're talking about.
Yeah. Did you see the
Yes.
video of the spooky thing behind the fence?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, yeah. I think that stuff's real. Yeah, 100%. But the honest, the funny thing is all of them stop, they halt at the name of Jesus, and yeah, yeah,
Really?
yeah. There's a lot of reports of this. Yeah. Yeah, like, and in the, like, official files of, like, the stuff that's coming out for all this UAP stuff too, not a lot of people are talking about this unless they're already Christian, just happen to be in this niche, but, like, they've mentioned that, like, there's been people who've been like, "Oh, Jesus," like, they say Jesus, but they're, like, Christians, and they kinda say it real, and then, like, the thing will halt or stop.
You bring a nuanced perspective to this entire discussion to where you're aware of the criticisms, you're aware of the quote unquote devil's advocate,
Yeah,
right? No pun intended. But you also recognize that there's enough historical evidence and personal experience and spiritual
yeah.
happenings to very much justify a belief
Yeah,
in this
honestly,
faith.
I don't think you can convince me otherwise at this point. Like, it's not like a debate in my mind whatsoever anymore. It's
And
like
why
at
would and honestly, why would you want to be convinced? I know you don't personally, but in my opinion, wouldn't you rather have the view that there is a God?
In a way, it's definitely a much safer perspective to have, but it also asks more of you if you're gonna take it seriously.
It's a great point. And it's not like it's something you can take lightly. If you really want to be somebody that claims to be a faith
Yeah.
of the Christian faith, this is something that you have to take seriously.
God is
Yeah.
God, and that's big.
Well, I think there couldn't be anything better to end on, man. I just want to
Yeah.
thank you so much for jumping on. This is a discussion unlike I've ever had on the show, and I cannot wait for people to see this because I think discussions like these need to be had more often. And so
Yeah.
I'm deeply grateful for you for jumping on and sharing a little bit of your life.
Oh, yeah. All love, bro. Thank you for having me on. It was awesome.